Hunting and gathering food, Kalispel. The seasons. The Kalispel Indians gathered food according to the seasons. The Kalispel moved around within the Lake Pend Oreille region. In the spring, the Kalispel would gather in the chief's lodge to talk over their summer tasks. The chief would suggest summer campsites. The chief knew in general where each family would go during the summer. In the springtime, the Kalispel dug glacier lily bulbs in the Pend Oreille River Valley. The roots were high in carbohydrates, and the Kalispel enjoyed eating these roots after eating mostly meat in the winter. In May and early June, the Kalispel moved to where there were camas roots. The women used digging sticks, which was a little like a spoon on a long handle. The digging stick was made of deer antler or hard wood. Sometimes men helped dig, but more often men and boys hunted in nearby hills. When women uprooted the camas bulb, they broke off the stalks and packed the bulbs in cedar bark bags. They carried them to ovens made from rock-lined shallow pits. The camas bulbs were steamed in mounds with layers of firewood, sod, bark, skunk cabbage, and camas stalks. After 2 or 3 days, the bulbs were then dried in the sun and put into bags. The Kalispel carried them to the village, where they were sometimes ground in stone mortars as flour. The flour was baked with pine moss into black cakes, which were then broken into pieces and stored. Women customarily stored foods on platforms to protect them from mice. A few camas might be bagged raw for winter eating. While they visited, Kalispels and other Indians pulled steaming camas from their ovens, coated them with bear grease or deer marrow, and munched them. A delicacy, camas was also considered healthful. It was said that eating 3 dried camas a day would keep a man alive for a year without hunger pangs. After digging camas, the tribe broke into family bands or task groups for summer. A few Kalispels occasionally trekked to the Spokane River to gather sweet wild onions to trade for white camas. Some Kalispel who traveled near Kalispel Lake gathered Indian potatoes, a small root dug with a stick and boiled for storage. Some Kalispel dug wild carrots to be mashed and boiled. Children pulled them to chew raw parsnips, cattail shafts, and other roots. Women and children climbed into the mountains to gather berries. They would eat the juicy ones on the spot and collect the rest in bark baskets soft enough to avoid crushing. Usually, one woman sat removing berries from the branches while others brought branches to her. This natural pruning seemed to benefit the bushes. Berries with pulp and seeds were sun-dried for other use. Some of the dried berries were formed into cakes and then smoked over a fire. The cakes were stored in bags. When it began to snow, usually in October, the Kalispel people gathered again at a winter campsite chosen by the chief. They would continue to hunt on snowshoes near the camp, fish through the ice, and set snares and traps for small game. Men and teenage boys would go on winter hunting expeditions. They would search for animal tracks, and when they found them, circle the prey, usually deer or caribou. They used bow and arrows and then hung the carcass in a tree. The hunters returned to Camp Happy, and the next morning, the chief sent men to bring in the deer, then distributed the meat. Some smoked the meat, some boiled it, and others ate it raw. Generally, Kalispel celebrated finding meat in winter, gorging themselves, for they might go hungry for weeks before another successful hunt. Fishing. The Kalispel fished from canoes in summer and ice holes in the winter. They used bone hooks to catch chub, squawfish, and trout. For canoe and ice fishing, men fashioned a three-pronged hook without barbs, baited with a grasshopper, grub, or trout gizzard, which stuck inside the fish that swallowed it. For large quantities of fish, the Kalispels used weirs. Weirs were made from flat balsam woven together and anchored to poles in shallow water. The weirs would steer the fish into underwater baskets of woven willow bark. Weirs varied in design and materials, of course, depending on location and the species of fish to be caught. They also used small sweep nets woven of strips of inner bark, pulled by men wading upstream, and scooped fish by hand in shallow pools. After some fresh fish were eaten at the fishing site, Kalispel women cleaned and suspended the rest by poles through the gills to be smoked over the fire. Kalispels used fish bones to make sewing needles, sharp awls to incise or puncture soft materials like skins, and similar tools. Twice a year, once as soon as they had dug camas, and again in September before snow came, Kalispel fishing parties traveled by canoe, with portages to the Salmon River. Salmon were speared in deep holes, caught in a stranding trap, a fence to halt downstream migration, or sometimes, when the run was heavy, simply scooped by hand from shallow water. The salmon, cleaned and cut into strips, were hung in trees to dry and then rolled into packs to be hauled home. Kalispel often joined other Indian tribes at Kettle Falls on the Columbia River to catch salmon. Kalispels often, but not regularly, caught salmon at Kettle Falls on the Columbia, where they joined Colvilles and other Indians or toiled down to the Spokane for salmon. It is astonishing the number of salmon which ascend the Columbia yearly, and the quantity taken by the Indians, observed missionary. It is not uncommon for them to take 1,000 a day. Their mode in the Spokane is to make a weir and then spear them. In many places they spear in the night by firelight. Small and large game. Kalispels hunted animals and fowl year-round, with an intensive hunt in August and September to prepare for winter. For small animals, men favored snares or deadfalls. They built these traps to drop a heavy log or a loaded platform on the prey when it tripped a baited trigger. Even young bears could occasionally be killed in a large deadfall. Wary older bears usually tore the trap apart to steal the deer meat bait. Bears were difficult to skin with the stone blades they used. Bears were killed only for their meat. Kalispels hung a dead bear over a fire to burn off the fur. Then they baked the bear meat immediately on hot rocks because bear meat did not keep well. Snares were made of sinew loops, slip knots greased with pitch, hung along animal trails and tied to logs or to spring poles to jerk the prey into the air. A diligent Kalispel hunter might set 100 snares or deadfalls, which he visited every other day, knowing other hunters would respect his territory. Kalispels constructed a stubby bow about 2 feet long, using arrows tipped with sharpened stone, perhaps obsidian traded from the Thompsons, who were fur trappers and traders just north of them. The bow shot with good power at close range for hunting large animals and waterfowl. If a Kalispel shot a duck or goose, he canoed into the water to retrieve it. The Kalispel did not train dogs to fetch downed birds, although dogs on occasion treed bears for him. In summer, Kalispel hunters with bows and arrows crept up on the deer, resting from flies in thickets, or concealed themselves beside salt licks to shoot deer by moonlight. In winter, when a deer broke through the crusted snow, a man on snowshoes might be able to run up to it with his bow and arrow. Large snares snagged deer walking head down along trails. Sometimes large groups hunted deer, the hunters hiding with bows and arrows near a forest clearing, at a cliff, or in a draw, and the drivers, men and women, shouting and beating sticks in a fearful noise, stampeding a herd toward the hunters. Sometimes lines of small fires were set to frighten deer toward the waiting bowmen. The Kalispel would also drive deer off a cliff. If a deer was swimming, the Kalispel would use their spears or bows and arrows. Occasionally, Kalispel men would chase a deer on foot. Kalispel hunters used a variety of calls to lure fowl and deer to places where they could be killed easily. A group hunt might yield 10 or a dozen deer. The Kalispel got the horse in the 1700s and could ride to the upper Missouri to hunt the buffalo. Buffalo jumps were used to run buffalo over a cliff. If this did not kill the bison, a V-shaped corral below was used to ensnare them. Another type of hunting buffalo was the decoy method. The V-shaped trap was employed again on a steep incline. One hunter would put on a buffalo robe, complete with horns, and would get down on all fours and crawl in among the herd and bleat like a baby buffalo. Buffalo have a keen sense of smell, but very poor eyesight. As the decoy crawled away from the herd, the buffalo followed him into the corral. The decoy then squeezed out through an opening that the buffalo could not. The band of hunters moved in and killed the beast with bow and arrows. Buffalo meat was cut into strips and turned into jerky. It is also believed the Kalispel may have put rattlesnake poison on the tips of their arrows.